let's talk intuitively about what a pattern, what a prompt is doing, and how the patterns in the prompt sort of tap into the capabilities of a large language model. And sort of, I think looking at some examples will help to give you a sense of how your prompts are really affecting and eliciting different behaviors from the underlying large language model that you're interacting with. So let's take a look at this example. I want to start off by talking about pattern. Pattern's really important. Remember, as we talked about, large language models are trained to basically predict the next word. They're constantly trying to predict the next word based on what came before. So you give it a sentence and it's trying to predict the next word. And then it's taking that and adding it and trying to predict the next word, and over and over and over. And so it was trained on large pieces of the internet trying to predict the next sentence. So one of the things that it's learning to do is to recognize patterns that tell it what the next word should be. That's basically what it's doing. Now, this is a really simple example of this concept. I'm going to tell ChatGPT, complete this story, and I start with, Mary had a little, and I stop. Now, if you know the nursery rhyme, it's Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow. And you can imagine that this story showed up over and over and over and over in the data that ChatGPT was trained on. So when I say Mary had a little, that is a very powerful pattern that ChatGPT has seen many, many, many times. And so it immediately tries to pick up with lamb, its fleece is white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. So that pattern was seen so many times that ChatGPT, when I put in the first part of it, it immediately responds with the next part of the sentence. It knows where to pick up. So one thing we have to think about is, if we know the right patterns, if we can tap into things that the model has been trained on and seen over and over and over again, we'll be more likely to not only get a consistent response, so we're going to consistently get a particular completion of Mary had a little because it's been seen so many times in the training data. We're going to get more consistency, but we're also going to more likely get a particular sort of ability to tap into it, to unlock it. Like if we want a particular behavior, we want to have the right pattern that we're tapping into. Now, let's look at what happens if we change the pattern a bit. And so I say, rather than, Mary had a little, I say, complete this story. A girl named Mary had a microscopic. Now, this isn't the pattern that it was trained on anymore, right? And it says, a girl named Mary had a microscopic friend named Max. Max was so small, you could only see him through a microscope. Despite his size, he had a big personality and was always eager to go on adventures with Mary. One day, Mary decided to take Max on a trip to the local pond. She carefully placed him on a lily pad. Now, one of the interesting things is you can imagine that when you start talking about microscopic, that you can think about, there's probably descriptions of going to a pond and doing, science with a class of students. I mean, I almost have a vision of it reading stories about, students getting samples of pond water and looking at them under a microscope. But the important thing is you notice that Mary had a little, created a very, very specific response. Whereas a girl named Mary had a microscopic creates a much different response. And then if we go and rerun this, we get something completely different. Pet named Max. Max was a tiny creature that lived in a small jar. And so, this pattern isn't as strong. There are words in this pattern that are strong and sort of give context that help to shape the story. But the pattern itself is not as strong as Mary had a little. So doing it again, whereas the other story changed completely, I'm still getting the same completion with this. I'm still getting lamb, its fleece was as white as snow. So every time I'm getting a very consistent, response to this pattern. So one of the things to think about when you're writing a pattern or writing a prompt is, what patterns do I have in my prompt, and what patterns will that probably tap into that the large language model was trained on. So if there's a very strong pattern in the prompt, you're more likely to get a response to that pattern. On the other hand, if that's not a pattern that it was trained on, it's not as clear, then you're going to have other things that are going to matter, like specific words. So a microscopic is going to fundamentally, that word is fundamentally going to change the behavior of this prompt because it's such a strong word. A girl named Mary is sort of generic. There were probably lots of stories with a girl named Mary. But microscopic, it has all of this feeling and implications to it, and that's going to then influence the large language model's output. Specific words alone, because of the patterns around those words, like microscopic is always going to be talked about in the context of small things probably, or maybe in terms of things like in this case, like a small creature that lived in a glass jar. That word itself has a strong sort of pattern of other words that are coming around it, but it's not as strong as the pattern Mary had a little. Now, one thing to note is that when you're writing prompts, you want to be really specific, or you want to provide enough detail in your words that the large language model will know the right level of detail to put into the output. So if your words are very generic and high level, then you're more likely to get an output that is also generic and high level. So if you look at this example, I say discuss Vanderbilt University, and I get a very generic sort of response. It's a private research university located in Nashville, Tennessee, founded in 1873 by Cornelius Vanderbilt, ranking, other things. Now, if I want something really specific, I need to make sure that ChatGPT has the right words and context in order to answer my question. So ChatGPT is not a mind reader. You have to give it the context. You have to give it the words that are going to elicit the right response. If I go back and I say discuss Vanderbilt University with respect to Kirkland Hall, it's a specific building on campus, then it changes the output. I get a much more specific output. I get Vanderbilt University, private research university located in Nashville, Tennessee. Now we notice we're getting this fairly consistently, both of them. So that's probably pattern or information that the model was trained on and saw over and over again on different web pages for Vanderbilt and different documents. And then it cues in on the Kirkland Hall, and it starts discussing Kirkland Hall. It's one of the most iconic buildings on Vanderbilt University campus, named after James H. Kirkland. It then talks about Kirkland Hall, Kirkland Hall, Kirkland Hall. And so we've now completely changed the output. Now, even though we had shared a common beginning, we got a much more targeted output. And the key to this is that we added in specificity into our prompt about what we wanted, the details. So if you think about asking it to write something or to analyze something, it's always helpful when you say with respect to, and give it very specific words or names or things that you want it to then use to trigger the output. Because what we see is this Kirkland Hall is a very powerful word that then gets woven into the whole discussion. It's a powerful name of a building. If we just say generically, at a high level, we don't use specific words, we don't use a specific context, we're going to get very generic stuff. And this is probably stuff that if you go and look at descriptions on Wikipedia, descriptions on Vanderbilt's web pages, this is like the most common types of information that you see. So in order to break out of the mold of what is common, you need to inject the more specific ideas that you want in the output, or you need to inject patterns that will help tap into those more specific things. So this is an important aspect in that if you just use it and you ask it generic questions, you're going to get generic answers. If you ask it average questions and average things, you will get average answers. To really use it powerfully, you have to use your own creativity and thought to get specific about details, aspects of what you want discussed, and think about what are the right patterns to put into your prompt in order to trigger the behavior that you want, like we saw in this Mary Had a Little Lamb. Or we might want to do the opposite. We might know that we're going to get a very generic response because certain things have been seen a lot. And so we need to come up with tricks or patterns or specific words that will help break us out of those patterns that we're seeing in the training data so that we can get something that's more of what we want. So we don't want to be trapped into the completion of Mary Had a Little Lamb So we go and add specific words like microscopic and a girl named Mary so that it's not so strong, so that we're not directly getting to that pattern. So just changing the wording can help us escape the patterns or get into the patterns depending on what we want. And then when we get output, the more generic our language, typically the more generic the output, the more specific our language, the more specific the output. And if we want certain things in that output, we need to make sure we have specific words and phrases that will tap into the specific things that we want in the output. Now, one of the other things is we're talking about output, but in the sense of a query. Like if I have specific words, it'll pull in the right information. One of the things we can also do is our prompt itself is a pattern that the large language model is learning from, and it can also tailor the output. So as we've seen in examples before, we can go in and do different things to try to affect the output. So for example, I might go in and actually, let's change this up a little bit. Let's say title, and we could say title of article, and then we could say author, and then we could say summary, and we could go in and give it something that it can look at and respond to. So now what I've done is I've gone and provided it some structure. Now it hasn't followed my structure exactly, and this is actually a failing in my prompt. I hasn't quite thought of the right structure, but I've gotten pretty close. So I went and influenced the output and the structure of the output by giving it additional pattern in my prompt itself. So one thing we can do is we can tap into patterns in order to influence the output. Another thing we can do is we can go in and use specific words and phrases to kind of be a query across or to basically collect learned information that's inside of the trained model. Another thing we can do is we can go in and we can provide information or basically new pattern that then influences the output. So in this case, I provided the structure of what I wanted and it somewhat followed it, and I could probably go and rerun this thing and get something a little better, and in this case I do. So this will be another thing that we can do is we can use our prompt to create sort of new patterns that it's trying to follow in the output. So the prompt itself can introduce new patterns or tap into them in some respects. So this is kind of creating pattern that it then is responding to as well. So when you're writing prompts, it's really important to think through this concept that it's trying to predict the next word, and it's doing that based on patterns it's learned in the past and patterns that are in the language of our prompt and patterns that are based on the word choice that we have, patterns that are based on the sort of organization, the sort of textual organization. And so those patterns can help us get a consistent response. If we have a really strong pattern that always produces a particular next token or next word, then we can rely on that. If we don't want that behavior, we can try to change our phrasing or our words so we get out of that trap. If we want to make sure certain information is pulled in, we need to create specific words or patterns that are more likely to have been seen in the context of that information that we want. If we want more generic information, then we probably need to give it more generic language or tell it that we want it to be more generic in some respect. And then finally, if we want the output to look a certain way, we need to give it sort of a sense of pattern in the output. We need to tell it about the structure. We need to give it words and patterns in our prompt that will be likely to influence the output. So you can imagine seeing title and author on an article was something that was fairly common. So if I put title and author in this way into my prompt, then it's more likely going to want to go and create title and author again and sort of replicating the pattern of what I'm showing here. So that should give you some intuition about how all of this works and some things to think about when you're going and structuring your prompts, picking words for them, picking the patterns in your language, and picking the things that you want to go into the output, how you structure and kind of explain the output to it.